ocean blue. I could drop my line 1,000 times and never find a fish as fine as you, as fine as you.
Hello everyone, this is Roger Brown, President of Berklee College of Music, and I want to welcome you to this symposium. Today we're going to try to provide some context around coronavirus and then give you some information about Berklee's plans for the fall. And we have three amazing experts here to talk to us about that. First though, I do want to acknowledge the murder of George Floyd and the racist incidents we've experienced around the country and tell you that Berklee as an institution is committed to fighting racism within our own institution, trying to help our students make an impact on the larger world, and calling on all of us to just look at our own hearts and minds and our own behavior and see how we can work to be more compassionate human beings and make the world a better place. Now, many of you have joined the call eager to find out about what Berklee and Boston Conservatory and Berklee Valencia are doing in the fall, and we're going to get to that. But there's a very detailed memo that's coming out on Monday, June 15th, this coming Monday. Not only a memo, but a huge number of frequently asked questions. So there's going to be a lot of information, more than we could ever cover on this call, coming out to you. But I will hit some of the highlights of that. And the short answer to that question is, we will welcome students back to the campus in the fall for a blended program of hybrid learning, with some courses being taught remotely and some being taught in person, appropriate social distancing and other precautions to try to keep our community safe. And we will offer a fully remote option for students who either cannot get to campus or don't want to come to campus. So you'll have either of those options, and I'll talk more about those in a minute. But I do want to move to our panel, and again, I'm going to be wrapping up at the end, so we'll come back to some more specifics about that. Our moderator today, and the person who really helped pull this together, is the wonderful chairman of our board, Susan Whitehead. Susan's a lawyer by training, vice chair of the Whitehead Institute, which is a prominent biomedical research institution. She has served on the board and the executive committee of MIT, has served as chair of Horizons for Homeless Children, which that's where I originally got to know Susan. I was one of the co-founders and the first chair of Horizons for Homeless Children board. And for the past 3 years, she served as the chair of the Berklee Board of Trustees and has been an amazing ally and resource to me and to the entire institution. So Susan.
Thanks, Roger. And I just want to do a quick shout out to Roger and his really incredible leadership of Berklee over the past 16 years. His leadership has been very important at various points throughout these past 16 years and has been particularly evident over the coronavirus planning period over the past several months and in thinking about how we're going to prepare for the fall. So everybody who's joining us on Zoom, welcome and thank you for joining us. You represent students, families, faculty, staff, trustees, friends, and supporters. It's really good to have this hour with you in conversation with our panelists. So as Roger said, we're about to announce the particulars of a very big decision regarding campus life at Berklee this coming fall. All of this is in the context of coronavirus. And I just want to say it's been very clear that it's been quite a steep learning curve for Berklee and the leadership at Berklee. It's required nonstop work and planning, and it's required a very exacting reflection and learning about what we needed to do and what we will continue to need to do, but it's also required a great deal of flexibility in our thinking. So we wanted to have this conversation with you today to talk about some of the things that are on everyone's minds. People want to know about vaccines, therapeutics, testing, medical observations, and finally, what this means for our Berklee community. We are all in this together. Now let me talk about the format of how we hope to spend the next hour. Each of our panelists are going to speak with you in response to questions from me, for about 8 minutes. Then we're going to open this up to a question and answer period. So if you look at your screen, at the bottom of the screen, if you click on it, you're going to see a Q&A icon. And what we'd ask you to do throughout the course of this hour is click on that icon. If you have any questions, submit your questions, and we're going to try and get to as many of them as we possibly can at the end of this hour. Wish we could get to all of them, but I think there are over 1,000 people on this call, so it's unlikely that we're going to be able to get to every last one. And before I introduce our first panelist, I just want to say something about all of our panelists. They all have very impressive, deep, and broad resumes. My introduction of them will not go into all the detail. We just don't have enough time to do that. So please, I'd urge you, if you have, you want to know more about any of them, they all have a lot of information about them online, and I'd encourage you to go online and look up more information about them. So let's launch in. I want to begin with Dr. Noubar Afeyan. He is the CEO of Flagship Pioneering, which is a very important venture capital firm cultivating and investing in early stage discoveries. Dr. Afeyan has co-founded and helped to build 24 successful life sciences and technology startups. Particularly relevant for today's panel, one of those startups, where Dr. Afeyan is co-founder and chairman, is called Moderna. We've all heard of Moderna at this point because it is a leading player in developing a coronavirus vaccine. So to kick this off, I'd like to ask you, Noubar, I'd like to ask you, we all hear that we're all going to be fine when a vaccine is developed. Can you help explain this landscape to us?
Well, hi, Susan, Roger, panelists, everybody listening. Thanks for having me. I can try to explain it. That's the way I understand it. And let me start at the highest level and just say that what we're all enduring from my vantage point is a fairly natural, albeit dangerous battle between two life forms. Our life form as humans and a predator which is basically transmitting itself through our social nature. That's at least the way I understand it. And so these types of natural battles are going on across the globe all the time. We just don't pay much attention to them except when they concern us. And in this case, it is more global, distributed, and impacting life than anything we've seen for at least 100 years. The reason I frame it that way is because you then have to say, okay, well, what do we have going for us and what does the virus have going for it? The virus has basically, however it's evolved, going for it. We have some other things, which is technology, strategy, and science. And that's what you're seeing play out. In the first instance, the policymakers very rapidly deployed a strategy of separating people so that the very transmissions that prey on our social nature become weakened. We then have used technologies such as diagnostic technologies, testing, which a lot has been talked about. Now therapeutics are being developed to try to ease the course of the disease and in some cases prevent deaths. And then ultimately the vaccines. And why vaccines? Because our collective human immune systems are ultimately what beat back these types of attacks. And the interesting thing is that our immune systems are not connected, so that if one person's immune system solves this problem, the other immune systems have no idea how to solve the problem. And that's where vaccines come in. Vaccines can basically transmit broadly the code that will cause an immune system to actually be able to make a successful preventative battle against the virus that's trying to infect it. So in a broad picture way, that's what we're seeing play out. I can tell you a little bit about the vaccine side of this since I'm involved in it through our company, Moderna. And there it's actually very interesting, perhaps for the audience, to realize that much of what's being done in this space are technologies that are completely new. In other words, in the case of Moderna, neither its technology nor the company existed more than 10 years ago. And in a relatively short time frame, the work that's gone into preparing a whole new class of medicine, which is called messenger RNA. Those of you who suffered through biology in your education will remember that the way biology is meant to work is that DNA codes for RNA and messenger RNA codes for proteins. Well, messenger RNA as a drug has no precedent. And it so happens that it's a very rapidly deployable way to try a vaccine, which is what we've been doing.
So we hear there are a whole bunch of different vaccines which are in development right now on a very expedited basis. We hear that over $1 billion is being spent to develop them. Do you think this is going to end up, that we will end up with more than one vaccine if we're lucky? Should we end up with more than one?
Yes, sure. So let me zoom in a bit more and talk about what's actually playing out here. So in early January, the sequence of this virus was posted publicly as a call to arms, if you will, for whoever was going to work on this problem to have this information. From there, in a matter of days, at least our company and many others entered that process, and we, within 40 days, had prepared a completely de novo, that is unprecedented vaccine that went to the NIH for them to do the testing. As many of you who follow this know, that first phase of testing is largely completed. The initial results from that were encouraging. And just this morning, a couple of hours ago, whoever has looked up the news, we announced that we have finalized the arrangements with the FDA to start our phase 3 trials, which will involve 30,000 people. We'll start, we expect, in early July, and should give us definitive answers. But we're not the only ones, and we're happy we're not the only ones, because there are literally over 100 other vaccines that are being pursued, and they fall into 4 categories. What you can do is either take a virus, the very coronavirus that is infecting us, and basically weaken it and give it to people in its weak form and hope that the immune system can learn from that how to fight it off, even while not being severely infected. That's a traditional virus approach. The second is you can take proteins that are parts of the virus and make them in artificial systems outside the body and then give it to a patient. That's the other traditional vaccines that we take with influenza, et cetera, every year. Then you can have DNA-based vaccines, a little newer, where another virus tells the cells what to do. And then finally, this messenger RNA. There are 5 companies, 4 very large pharmaceutical companies and Moderna, that have advanced enough that the US government has decided to fund much of the work and advance it quickly. And we expect that several vaccines will ultimately get across the finish line. And we like that because the production scales are such that it would be inconceivable that any one company could supply the billions of doses that are going to be needed. We expect, from a timing standpoint, by the way, it's the hardest thing to speculate on, but we expect that it will be in 2021, perhaps the first or second quarter, before we will have a formally approvable, at least, set of data. Whether it succeeds or not, the science will tell. But at least from a mechanics standpoint, that's how long it will take. And in the meantime, as many of us know, for emergency uses, there are ways in which the government and the FDA can make different approaches available. Again, we have a long way to go to prove safety, to prove efficacy. But given the number of approaches, I find it a reasonable expectation that into 2021, certainly in the first half, we will have some vaccines joining the fight with their treatments, with tests, with distancing, etc.
So all of that, that timeline that you're talking about, which is an incredibly expedited timeline, isn't it? I mean, nothing has been, in my lifetime, has been accelerated in this way that I'm aware of. You also have to really ramp up production so that you can make this available. And is that a sequential thing? Are you doing production later? Are you working on production now before you really have a product?
Yeah, look, it's a good question, Susan. So one of the reasons why we have the ability to move very quickly is that the financial resources are available, both by the companies and by the government. And this is not just in the US, also across the world, but particularly in the US where we are, to begin production of the vaccine even before we know it works. And it might seem wasteful and risky to people, but if we did the opposite, which is wait till the vaccine works to start production, there would be 6 to 9 months of waiting time by the time we know we have an effective vaccine that could prevent it. And all the people that would die in the meantime or get affected health-wise by this would be basically, we cannot help them. So the only way to deal with that is to go at risk, which is what we and others are doing. I should mention, Susan, just because we have limited time, just for the audience that is coming from kind of more of from the art world primarily, to just kind of realize that, things are going fast and things are being done that have not been done before. And a lot of this is science, but it's such a frontier of science. This is such uncharted territory that much of it is far more improvisational and far more art-like than it is science-like. And that's the kind of human spirit of creativity, of experimentation, of struggle, of small wins among all sorts of losses that produces the novelty of a vaccine, of a therapeutic. And I think as people in the art world, the music world, look at this as a foreign world, I can tell you, having grown up in a family with a mother who was a formerly trained concert pianist from the Paris Conservatory, it feels a lot more like art than it does science.
I love that explanation, Noubar. So I have a question, something I think that's just fundamentally confusing to many of us. It appears that some vaccines are easier to develop. I think of chickenpox and measles, and then I think of AIDS. And for HIV, it has proven to not be possible yet to develop an effective vaccine. And where does coronavirus fit in this landscape?
Well, we can't say for sure because there's so much unknown about coronavirus. But if we look backwards, Susan, one of the big distinctions of HIV is that HIV infects the very cells that are involved in our immune response to HIV. And so when it's a little bit like if you infiltrate the military, that's a very different thing than if you infiltrate a different part of society and the military is free to fight. So I've always thought that HIV and other such viruses that hamper the immune response should be difficult to develop a vaccine against. And yet others, which in this case, there's really no evidence that the immune cells are being attacked rather than the endothelial cells that line the vasculature and other types of cells, that makes a difference. The second is how much we know about the virus. In the coronavirus case, we don't know a whole lot, so there's a lot of risk until we can get there. But in chickenpox and others, we knew a lot about these viruses. And so I think there's always people want to know, is it possible that we can never develop a vaccine to this? It's always possible, but I think the likelihood is low given what we already know and what we've already been showing, not just within the company I know, but also many other companies and scientific teams.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you, Noubar.
Thank you.
I'm afraid we have to move on to our next panelist. I wish we had a lot more time. Our next panelist is Dr. Paula Johnson. So Dr. Johnson is the president of Wellesley College, but prior to leading Wellesley, Dr. Johnson was a professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School, as well as a professor of epidemiology at Harvard's Chan School of Public Health. She is a cardiologist who founded and led the Connor Center for Women's Health and Gender Biology at Brigham and Women's Hospital. Particularly relevant for today's discussion in the era of coronavirus, Dr. Johnson is leading the initiative to establish high-level guidance regarding testing for all of Massachusetts colleges and universities. Welcome, Dr. Johnson.
Thank you, Susan.
So you're a physician with a degree in public health and a college president. It's all intersecting. And you're leading the group now to provide the high-level guidance to colleges and universities in Massachusetts. You have a particularly unique perspective. So we're all hearing about different kinds of testing and the advantages and disadvantages of the various kinds of testing. What are the most important things for us and for the people who are joining us online today to know about testing if and when we are back on campus in the fall?
Thank you, Susan. And I just want to say thank you, Roger, for inviting me. And Noubar, it was wonderful to hear you. And I like to say, you know, people want to know if there's light at the end of the tunnel. Well, you've provided that light, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the tunnel that'll get us there, hopefully, in terms of what we do until that light shines brightly. You know, the purpose of testing, for this purpose, there are a few purposes. One is to test people with symptoms, and then to quickly isolate those people if they have the disease, and then to better understand how we identify those people who've had significant contact with them, and do what we call quarantining of those people. So that's one type of testing. Today I'm really going to focus on, because that is something I'm pretty sure that Dr. Kogelman will talk about. But as we bring our students and our faculty back to campus, what we really want to do here is to prevent the introduction of new cases to our campuses, and then prevent the spread of disease on our campuses. And I think the most important thing for us to remember is that testing is going to be, I believe, important, but what's also critically important is to follow the public health measures that have been implemented and mandated by the state. Wearing of masks, social distancing, hand washing, screening of symptoms. These interventions actually do work. And we know we can drive down what we call RT, or the rate of transmission of disease, by implementing those strategies. They're not easy all the time, but I think that it is just so critically important to recognize that they are effective. So where does testing come in? Well, one issue is that let me just begin by saying the CDC has not made any recommendations around what we call surveillance or screening. So what we did was really try to best understand what the role might be on our campuses by getting some of the best minds and modelers, we call them people who create these models, for us to understand how we might apply testing to diagnose mainly asymptomatic people. And it's mainly asymptomatic young people. People in the college age tend to do well with the disease. The issue is that they can tend to be carriers of the disease and infect others. It can spread within, whether you're in a dormitory. I know there's a lot of fear in terms of faculty interface. So the purpose of the screening really is to identify asymptomatic cases, to get them, if they're positive, out of the community, to isolate them, understand who those contacts were, and then really protect them as well. So with that, we've really identified through, we're so fortunate here in Massachusetts with the wealth of amazing scientists. We've really looked at two models, one from MIT and one from Mass General and Harvard Medical School, and they really converge using very different techniques. And what we're really thinking is that screening somewhere between every 3 to 5 days in our higher risk populations would be appropriate. And this is really going to have to be customized to different campuses, depending upon what your living situation is, where you're located, but somewhere in that range seems to be reasonable to identify those asymptomatic cases, to pull them out, and to move forward.
Can I just ask you a brief question about that before you continue? You're talking about testing everyone every 3 to 5 days, or are you talking about the people who are vulnerable if they do become ill?
So we have looked at different levels of risk. And the way that we are thinking about this is that your highest risk are those who are vulnerable, maybe with autoimmune disorders, immunocompromised, but also our students living in residence in very close quarters, okay? That is in and of itself a risk. So if you look at the highest risk, it's those students, it's those who are immunocompromised, and we're also putting in that group those faculty and staff who have a lot of face time with students. So if there, for example, are those who are living in the dorms, adults living in the dorms with students, or for athletic directors who are, or coaches who have a lot of face-to-face contact. So that would really be your highest level risk. And then, I think the next level would be commuting students, others who don't have as much face time, and then you kind of decrease risk from there. So, I think that we've come up with a reasonable stratification strategy in terms of how you might determine testing in on your campus. And then the big nut to crack really is access. How do we actually get access to testing? We all know that that's been a major problem across the country. We've done better recently in Massachusetts, but we're nowhere near where we need to be. And, the ideal test for this purpose would be a really cheap test that our students and faculty could use, what we call point of care. They could just use it wherever they are and get a result. That does not, at this point, exist. And there's a lot of money being put into the development of tests, approval of tests, but we're talking about what's going to be available in late August and September. Right. So here we're really talking about the gold standard, which is called a PCR test. I won't go into the details, but it really is an outstanding test. And we fortunately have been now working with the Broad. The Broad is a scientific institute that is part of Harvard, MIT, and the Whitehead. And we have been really assured that they have the ability to scale up. And we are about to roll out proposals to colleges and universities across the state in the next few days for people to take advantage of.
I'm really sorry, but we're out of time. Is there anything else that you just must tell this group?
No, I think it's that one, preventative, the public health measures really do work, and second is that we've, as a community of higher education, we've worked very hard to ensure the highest possible safety without a vaccine of our campuses. And that is really what we've been committed to. I know Roger has been on the group, the larger group of presidents. We've been all very much committed to making sure that our students, staff, and faculty have the highest, as I said, highest level of safety as they return.
Thank you. And thanks for all you're doing.
Thank you.
Moving on to Dr. Cogelman. Dr. Laura Cogelman is director of the Infectious Disease Clinic, as well as director of the Travelers Health Service at Tufts Medical Center. Dr. Cogelman is board certified in internal medicine and infectious disease, and we at Berklee are delighted that she's joining us today as Berklee's medical liaison to Tufts Medical Center. Welcome, Dr. Cogelman. Now, I know that you've been working on the ground tirelessly, and you've squeezed in this panel during your clinical practice today. So thank you especially for joining us. Tell us about what you're seeing on the floor and then patients you're treating.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for including me in this panel. And I also want to say that the collaboration that we've had with Berklee over the last year has been an incredible experience, and I think is really worked out very fortuitously to sort of launch us into this next phase of involvement. And so, as been touched upon, the testing is really critical, and it's still something that's constantly evolving. I think something that can really describe this whole epidemic is flux. So every time we think we figured it out, we get some new data and something else comes out to sort of change our path a little bit. But I think continuing to be flexible with the testing options, what that best testing option is, what the best testing frequency is going to be, I think are going to continue to evolve, not just between now and August, but after August into September, October, as we continue along. But one thing I do want to say that will be consistent is access to high-level care, no matter what happens. So obviously there's phenomenal healthcare throughout all of Boston. We do have this liaison with Berklee and Tufts, and it's an academic medical center, full-service institution. We do have not only symptom screening clinics, but we have patients with symptoms who can be evaluated quickly, as well as a range of all subspecialties, because we get very focused on COVID, but there's still other medical problems out there, and we can sort of take care of all those that come along as well. And I think something else that to offer a little reassurance is, although we don't want to see that second wave, and hopefully we won't, but having gone through this first wave throughout all of Boston, at Tufts as well, we've kind of had some experience, and we've been able to ramp up our services. We've been able to take care of our patients appropriately at Tufts, and I think also throughout all the other institutions in town. We never ran out of ventilators. We never had to share ventilators. We created intensive care unit beds where there weren't before, and we used a lot of different staff from a lot of different subspecialties who amazingly rallied to the call to action and all worked together to provide extremely high level care, but we never got to a point where we couldn't provide what we wanted to. That's not to say that it wasn't a very complicated few months, and that we obviously had some very, very sick patients, but we were able to serve all of them. We also never had a situation where we ran out of our personal protective equipment. We were always able to maintain it. We had to reallocate or think about using it in different ways, but we never got to a point where we lost what we needed for protection for ourselves and for our patients. And what this means is when the next wave comes, we can ramp back up again. We kind of had seen it before. We have several months, hopefully, to continue to stockpile the equipment that we need, the PPE that we need, so we will be ready when that next wave comes. The other thing is also to give perspective that we obviously hear about all of the terrible cases, and there are definitely patients who had horrible outcomes. But you never hear about the patients who did fine. That doesn't make social media. I had COVID and I was better in 2 days. That is not interesting. That doesn't make news, but that is what happens actually in the majority of cases. It is certainly the older individuals with multiple comorbidities who do have the hardest time, but that's also not to say every single 70-year-old with heart disease is going to succumb to the disease. And I personally saw several patients with in their 70s, in their 80s, with medical problems, beyond counting on your two hands. And COVID was an incidental finding. It wasn't even their primary problem. They never became symptomatic. Or people who came in and were symptomatic, but left in a couple of days and did fine. One of my primary areas of interest is HIV. Several of my HIV positive patients who are very well controlled on their meds did get infected, never had to come to the hospital, did fine throughout the course. So I think, it helps to hear a little bit of the good outcomes, because we don't hear about them. Obviously, what comes on the news are all the bad outcomes. The other thing that we have is increased access to testing, which, as Dr. Johnson alluded to, was a huge struggle across the country and in Massachusetts at the beginning, getting the right test, getting the test results back quickly, really having to figure out how to manage patients in these window periods. And the testing options have dramatically improved. The turnaround time has dramatically improved, and they're going to continue to improve so that we can serve our patients better. And in terms of treatment, we're also a little bit further ahead than we were in March. There is no slam dunk. There is no cure. There is no definite medication that's going to fix it, but we have a lot more options than we did before. I think one thing that has been very challenging with this is that we obviously want to get as much information as possible. We're all experiencing it. We're all in the midst of it. We all want to do everything we can to help our patients. So the data is coming fast and furious, but normally the process is slow. You do a randomized double-blind control study, you'd have short-term outcomes, long-term outcomes, the data is analyzed and over-analyzed, and it's thoroughly vetted before it makes a publication, let alone the lay press, and everything has been sped up. So we see this, well, this study showed this, and this study showed the opposite, and this constant influx of information, which is challenging for us as providers, and of course, for the community as well. But we do have a couple of options. I will say hydroxychloroquine is not it. So that one is kind of, seems to be well off the table at this point. People have probably heard about remdesivir, which is an antiviral medication that stops the virus from making copies of itself. It's encouraging, particularly in using it in patients who are not so sick. So it did not necessarily have an impact on mortality, but did seem to decrease the severity of illness or duration of illness for people who were not as ill. So the thought is maybe to move it forward, to give it to people earlier on in the course of their illness. There's convalescent plasma, which I think a lot of people have heard about as well. That's infusing plasma with antibodies of people who have recovered. There's a small study that just came out that also looked encouraging. Again, probably needs to be given earlier on before people are really ill. They're looking at therapeutic antibodies, a range of different targets. There are these immune modulators, medications that sort of dampen this huge inflammatory response that COVID elicits and leads to a lot of the damage. Those are usually also given further along in the illness. So I think we're moving along. I think we have a lot of studies going on at Tufts and of course throughout Massachusetts, throughout the country, and we'll continue to get more information and hopefully be able to start to get these treatments out sooner. And again, as everybody else has said, the key component though to all of this is sticking with the stuff that we know, which is really adhering to the social contract, that you wear your mask, you socially distance, you follow good hand washing, and that you don't go to work or to school when you're sick. And I think that's very contrary to how most of us operate. As doctors, we never get sick, you know? And I'm sure you're incredibly hardworking students. They don't want to disappoint their faculty. They don't want to disappoint their peers. They don't want to disappoint themselves. But going to a practice or a class when they're ill is not going to do anybody any good. And it's going to be the main thing that's going to lead to more infection. So being honest on those symptom checkers and admitting that you're ill and going to get care is really critical. Right. That 120, sorry, I'll let you finish.
I wish that we had more time with you as well. This is very frustrating, but we need to move on. Is there any last word that you need this community to know?
The last thing I was just going to say is that even though that one healthy 20-year-old may be fine and not have a bad outcome, you don't know about the older professor or the peer who has an immunocompromising condition or the neighbor who is ill. It really is incumbent upon all of us to not just protect ourselves, but to protect each other.
Once again, we're all in this together, aren't we? Yeah. Thank you very much. And we'll get back during Q&A. I'm sure people will have questions for you. And now I'd like to just turn this over to Roger Brown. Most of you, I would imagine, on this phone call know Roger. He's really been a transformational leader at Berklee, and he's done that for the past 16 years. He's an exceptional and strong leader. He has energy, wisdom, deep analytical skills, broad experience, and deep compassion. He's an effective and trusted leader. So, effective and trusted leader, I turn it over to you now for comments.
Well, thank you, Susan. Thank you all to the panelists, Noubar, Paula, Laura. This has just been amazing. Exactly what we'd hoped for, to give some context about what's going on in the world in which we're living and the facts that inform the decisions that we're making. You know, we have over 100 questions. We're not going to be able to answer them all, but we're going to keep up with all those questions and make sure that when we send the memo out on Monday and the FAQ and subsequent discussions of this, we can answer all the questions that you have. But the highlights are, and we'll be announcing this formally on Monday, we're going to welcome students back to campus for this blended experience of in-person and virtual learning. And we're going to create an option for those who don't want to come back or can't come back to study remotely. In addition, there are two other options. A student can defer. We have very open deferral policies, or a student could study with Berklee online and transfer credits into the college. Most of those credits are transferable. Now, there's always a possibility that a resurgence happens and we have to change our plans. So let me just say as a caveat, I don't get to control how this disease progresses. based on everything I'm hearing and seeing from my colleagues, and we've done as much homework as we can do, we feel comfortable with this decision in the current context, but there are no guarantees right now. The number one reason we feel comfortable with making this decision is that you've heard that older people are more affected by coronavirus than younger people, but that differential is far greater than that qualitative statement captures. In the state of Massachusetts, there has not been a single 18 or 19-year-old who died of coronavirus. And in the 20 to 29-year-old age cohort, there have been a very small number, I think 15 deaths. And the expected fatality rate of coronavirus for that age cohort is about 1 out of 100,000. So to put that in perspective, when a student goes to an American college campus, they're taking about 7 times that level of risk that they would die of some kind of accident, usually vehicular accidents, pedestrian accidents, bicycle accidents, and other causes. So I'm not saying this is risk-free. There's no way we can wring all the risk out of having a student come back to campus. But this population in particular, especially the younger they are, the less vulnerable they are. So the bigger issue is how do we make sure that those people who are vulnerable are protected, not only those within the Berklee community, but in the neighborhoods that we live in, on public transportation, in the larger city. I'm going to challenge every family to make your own decision about your risk profile. We have students who are older. Not every student is in that age cohort. We have students with other confounding medical conditions. So that's a decision everyone needs to make for themselves. But for those who choose to come back, I think we have a plan that makes a lot of sense. So roughly 60% of the courses we'll be offering in September will be done virtually. That's for 2 reasons. So that older faculty or faculty who have other medical conditions are not in contact with students. We do not want to put someone who's immunocompromised in a vulnerable situation. And we had a reasonably good experience teaching many of our courses in the spring when we had to pivot to remote learning. About 40% of the courses will be done in person. And we've tried to prioritize those courses that are best done in person. Recording sessions in studios, ensembles playing music together, etc. Now, the key to this, as you've heard repeatedly, is social distancing and reducing the density in classrooms and taking the precautions that will slow the spread of this virus, so we keep transmission to an absolute minimum. So the model will include all the precautions you've been hearing about: testing, tracing, isolation of people who have symptoms, daily electronic symptom reporting, so that if someone has a symptom, they get tested and we can either isolate them if they have a positive test or let them go back to business if they have a negative test. The one thing we have learned, and I think Paula and Laura emphasized this, is that if we can get everyone to wear a mask, it appears that reduces the transmission rate somewhere between 60 and 80%. We have just purchased 100,000 surgical masks. We hope students will come with their own, but we're going to have plenty of masks. And the one thing I would say, I love our Berklee and Boston Conservatory students, but in the spectrum of students who comply with the wishes of authority and those who like to operate in a contrarian manner, I would say our students are iconoclastic and march to their own drummer. However, I've watched many of them at protests, wearing their masks. I think there's an ethos among young people that wearing a mask is a good thing. And I'm hoping we've been working with the SGA and other student groups to try to create a method of sort of peer pressure that encourages people to comply. As Laura mentioned, our medical system actually has done a pretty good job of keeping medical practitioners safe. My oldest daughter is a coronavirus nurse working on a COVID unit at Columbia Presbyterian Hospital. And I've obviously been in constant contact with her about what they're doing. And the results are pretty good. People like my daughter are in daily contact with people with extremely high viral loads of coronavirus and have managed to not get infected. So we'll obviously have heightened cleaning protocols, as I mentioned, the reduced classroom densities, but a lot of this will depend on a shared sense of responsibility on the part of us all to follow these guidelines. I also would like to say, and there'll be more on this forthcoming, thanks to the cooperation of our faculty, our staff, and administration, all of whom are foregoing any kind of pay increases this September, and many administrators have actually taken large pay cuts. We're not going to have a tuition increase from last year, so the tuition will go back to what it was last year. For those people who choose to be purely remote and therefore not having access to the campus, they will not pay the comprehensive fee, and we're going to offer them 2 additional summer programs at no extra charge so that they can get some of the experiential activity that they might have missed by being purely remote. I'm excited about our plan. And again, we're not going to be able to get to every single question, but we're going to lay it out in as much detail as possible. I think it makes sense. As Paula has mentioned, the local college presidents have been collaborating on this consistently. We have a weekly call. We've been sharing information in a way that's unprecedented. And Boston is the home of some amazing colleges and universities. So I feel like I have had access to enormous information, and I'm a recovering science geek myself. So it has been exciting for me to dig in and try to understand this and what we should do about it. So please stay tuned for the communication on Monday. We'll be giving you a lot of updates. We're going to have divisional discussions of what this means for students in different parts of the conservatory, the college, and our Valencia campus. So stay tuned. I would just like to close by saying, I think we have an incredibly special group of students, faculty, and staff. We have an institution that plays a really unique and important role in the world. And I was excited to hear Noubar talk about the creative process in science, the way that improvisation and artistry plays a role in science. And I think that's what our students are best at. So we're excited about the possibility of getting back together in a safe way to continue the learning and growth that is so part of what we're all about. So thanks.
Thanks, Roger. And thanks to all of our panelists. I think we're going to turn now to a couple of questions that have come in, and I'd like to start with one about masks. And the question is, a question about testing. And a simple question, probably not a simple answer. Why is it taking so long to develop this? What are the barriers to developing effective testing? And how hopeful are you feeling?
Looking forward, I'm very hopeful. I think that the federal government at NIH and there's a whole group that is really looking at innovations in testing. They're pouring a lot of money into this. But the question as to why we're so far behind, well, we kind of came into this unprepared, and we didn't ramp up early and adequately, because it's not impossible to do. We just didn't do it. And I think that we're now trying to play catch up. But I do think with what I said earlier in terms of our capacity across our colleges and universities to work with, as I said, to work with the broad, I think is really a unique and very important opportunity for us. Can I just say one last thing that I forgot to say earlier?
Sure.
Please, everyone, also get a flu shot. Please get your your influenza immunization. It is really critical, and we tend to go to coronavirus and, as Dr. Cogelman said, forget some of the other stuff. And this is going to be really important, particularly this year.
And when should people get them?
They usually come out at the end of September, around then. So I think as soon as they're available, it is really critical that our entire community, we can't mandate it, but I think our entire communities need to be really aggressive around being vaccinated.
Okay, message received. Thank you. Thank you. This is a question for Noubar, probably, and it's about vaccines. Do you anticipate, Noubar, that one vaccine is going to be effective for everyone?
Well, so 2 parts to this. I think that, well, we don't know. We're going to test. We're doing tests for people in the 18 to 55 age group. We're doing tests that are for, I won't call them older, but wise people, since I'm in the older group than that, or more experienced people, let's say. And we'll see. We just don't know yet. I think it's possible that at the right dose, there could be kind of effective coverage for most, but but all is a pretty difficult thing to say now. Also, there's much younger folks that we have to test. So I don't know. The interesting other question related to that, Susan, that comes up is how long will the coverage, how long will the protection last?
Yeah.
And that's also kind of impossible to tell. But the current thought process is that it will likely not be a vaccine that is you're going to have one shot and for the rest of your life you're protected against this coronavirus. That seems very unlikely given other kind of comparable situations. So whether it's every few years or every year, like the seasonal flu, is something that we also don't know. But we're certainly, at least in our own development programs, are preparing for the possibility that there may well be a booster shot that is used every few years. Hopefully, it's as many as we can get away with. But I think the notion, there are some vaccines that are being tried where the notion is you just give it once and then that's it. I think that's very unlikely.
Okay, but this is in part a wait and see. But your odds are that one shot is unlikely.
One shot is unlikely, and the same shot for everybody is unknown right now.
Okay, all right, thank you. That's helpful. I'd like to turn to a question about practically living on campus and what Berklee is thinking about in terms of dorms and roommates. One person to a room, two people to a room, family, student groups.
Yeah, great question. Our current thinking is that we will house we'll fill our dorm to about 70% of capacity using singles and doubles, but no triples or quads. And the premise for that is, as we talk to epidemiologists and people who think about human behavior from a public health point of view, they said you could put a student in a single room and expect them to stay there and never go talk to anyone else, but that's pretty naive. So the key is the social isolation when we're in larger groups, this daily symptom reporting and testing, so that if a roommate is positive, we detect it early and we isolate or quarantine and test the other roommate. That's the current thinking. And I have to say, if students are not in a dormitory, they're going to be living in an apartment someplace in an environment that is in some ways harder for us to control. We don't have the capacity to house our entire student body. So, I do think housing, getting to and from campus is going to be a challenge. Another challenge we're wrestling with is if a student has an in-person class and shortly thereafter has a remote class, but they don't have time to get home, where do they go to do that remote class? So we're working on options so students can socially distance as they're doing their remote class work. Part of the beauty of having as many virtual classes as we will have is those classrooms and private lesson rooms will be available for use for some of that remote study.
Good. There's a question that also has to do with campus life that's come in that I'd like to pass on to you. And that's a question about whether, how you're thinking about having testing on campus and the possibility of having some health staff on campus this coming fall.
We're working furiously on that question. Like, how does the testing actually happen? We're confident, as Paula has mentioned, that the capacity to test is expanding dramatically. And so we're pretty confident that we can get people tested. Whether we can do that on our site or whether they have to go elsewhere is an unknown at this point. There's some licensing and certification issues that we just have not figured out yet. But we have access to testing through other institutions that are nearby. So we're hard at work on that, and we'll have a better answer or a more complete answer soon.
Okay, we'll stay tuned. This is very frustrating for me because we are out of time. And there are lots of questions that I have that I would like to know the answer to. And I'm sure everybody who's online would like to do that. But I really want to thank all of our panelists. You're experts in your fields and you're extremely articulate, all of you. And this has been just a terrific hour. Thank you so much for participating with us. And Roger, I'd like to turn it over to you to close out our hour.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you for helping pull this together. I would also mention that the music you heard before we started is Berklee student music, written and produced by one of the people who helped organize this. And shout out to Melissa, Margot, Lindsay, and Greg who helped organize this whole thing. We are going to keep track of all your questions. So again, apologies that we can't answer them all now, but we're going to try to get you answers to your questions and be honest where we don't have complete answers yet. I would just go back to what I said before. You know, I love our students. I love our schools. I love our campus. Based on what I've seen and heard so far, I think we can safely have a way for people to come back, but it won't be business as usual. So especially to students, you know, we're going to need you to comply with these social distancing guidelines and encourage your fellow students to comply with them in order to achieve what we hope, which is a great learning opportunity and a safe, healthy campus. But again, thank you to all the panelists. Thank you, Susan, and we'll be in touch soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's always you on the horizon. Well, I've always got my eyes on